Hey, oceanography class. Let's talk about Chapter 15, Organisms of the Benthic Environment. Benthic organisms, or organisms that live on or in or attached to the substrate of the seafloor, make up more than 98% of the known marine species. That's a lot. Most benthic organisms live on the continental shelves, and a lot of their distribution is affected by surface ocean currents and biological productivity. Here you can see a sea urchin kind of crawling on the sea floor. The benthic organisms exist in all kinds of environments, ranging from rocky to sandy to muddy intertidal zones, or the muddy deposits of the deep ocean abyssal plains to the volcanic fields of the mid-ocean ridges. Now, in terms of benthic biomass, it's not as much as the floating pelagic phytoplankton, but in terms of species, they kind of dominate the number of different species, and that's a result of the varied environments in which they live. So the benthic biomass actually matches the surface chlorophyll distribution. And that's because where there is a lot of primary productivity, right, the basis of the food chain that supports many marine organisms, that's where the activity is, that's where the action is, that's where organisms are eating, feeding, dying, and that detritus will kind of fall down onto the sea floor where a lot of benthic organisms can feed. Here on this global map you can see the distribution of benthic organisms. Okay, so we find a lot of them on the continental shelves, so close to the continents, a lot of nutrients. These are highly productive areas. Okay, epifauna. These are organisms that are either attached to a substrate, kind of like a marine algae, or that move along over it, kind of like crabs, snails. They have a moderate diversity of different species that live in these environments. Here you can see one. This is an intertidal rocky shoreline that will host a lot of epifauna organisms. We see the greatest diversity at tropical latitudes and the greatest algae diversity at mid-latitudes. The intertidal zone is the area that's inundated during high tide and exposed during low tide. Remember when we talked about tides, there are spring and neap tides, so the tidal range can vary greatly, and so a lot of different organisms kind of encompass specific environments that are occasionally inundated by an incoming tide and occasionally exposed by a downgoing tide. Okay. The spray zone is above the spring tide zone. All right, so the highest of high tides during the spring tide, the spray zone's above that. So that's an area that's typically, dries out fairly quickly. The intertidal zone, this is also a relatively dry zone. It's the high tide zone. There's a middle tide zone that's covered by all high tides and exposed by all low tides, and then the low tide zone is typically wet. All right, and as you can see from this GIF, you can see all kinds of different organisms that encompass a community like this. So here's the spray zone. The highest high tides don't really inundate this area. What you typically find here are these little, I don't know if you've ever been to canals and stuff like that around the coastal areas. Could be Melbourne or in South Florida. You'll see a lot of these rock luces, and they're almost like little chittens, like cockroaches that just kind of scurry around in that area. You see periwinkles, which are these right here, and limpets. Okay, they're kind of like barnacle-like. And then in the high tide zone, so in the high tide zone, which is only kind of inundated during high tide, you'll find, again, more periwinkles, more limpets, chittens here, and also buckshot barnacles will show up. Okay. Then in the middle tidal zone, what you'll find here are mussels, sea lettuce, hermit crabs, a lot of soft-bodied organisms, algae, abalone, acorn barnacles, and gooseneck barnacles. And here, the organisms here have to fight for attachment sites, because that's the name of the game for these organisms. They have to attach to a substrate and then filter feed. Okay. In the spray zone and much of the high tide zone, these organisms have to fight out drying out, being exposed for too long. That's their environmental hardships. And then once you get completely covered by water, most of the tidal range, you'll find sponges, sea slugs, brittle stars. This is the low tide zone. The sea urchins, algae, kelp, sea cucumbers, and these guys have to deal with wave energy from incoming waves, and also predation are their environmental hardships. So in the spray zone, we call this the supratidal zone because it's kind of above the tides itself. Organisms have to avoid drying out. A lot of these organisms will have shells. Very few species of marine algae because they can dry out so quickly. So these are the organisms you would find. Let's look at pictures of them. Here are periwinkles. Might look familiar. Here are buckshot barnacles, and this is the rock loose. In the high tide zone, again, animals here will also have shells to avoid drying out. You'll actually find marine algae here that have thick cell walls to prevent desiccation. Rockweeds colonize first, and then other organisms kind of come in afterwards. And here you'll find sessile animals, ones that attach themselves to a substrate like barnacles and mussels. So here are some limpets. Okay, they attach themselves to rock. And then this is rockweed. All right, in the middle tidal zone, what you'll find here are more different types of species of marine algae and soft-bodied animals, which you typically don't find in drier areas. So here's a chitin and an acorn barnacle, almost looks like a volcano. And in the middle tidal zone, you'll find carnivorous snails and starfish. Starfish kind of slowly move around, and they kind of will open up clamshells and stuff like that. You'll also find sea anemones. These are sea anemones here. They have, like jellyfish, stinging nematocysts on their tentacles, and that's how they poison prey and then pull them into their gut and then feed on them in here. Very alien-like. So here's a sea star cracking a clam open and eating it. And here's a picture showing you the different zonations of these areas. This looks like low tide, so exposes a mussel bed. Okay. Then they're in the middle tidal zone. You'll also find hermit crabs. That's this guy right here. They have armored claws and upper body, but a soft abdomen. And what they do is they take over shells as their home, and as they outgrow them, they have to find new ones, mostly used for protection. Sea urchins here, you can see this one kind of squirming around a little bit out of the water. They have a 5-tooth mouth and a hard spherical shell, and those spines are for protection, so no other organism would like to eat them. We eat these. If you ever had or go to a sushi place, you can order this. Get some uni, it's delicious. All right, so here's another hermit crab. Here are more sea urchins in an intertidal zone. In fact, some areas in California, there are the sea urchins a lot of times eat the kelp beds. And I think there's like an invasive species of these that's edible. And so in California, they're urging or incentivizing people to eat sea urchins as much as possible to help with population control. So have at it. All right, the low tidal zone is abundant in algae and surf grass. What you see there, that's surf grass. A lot of the animals are hidden by seaweed and surf grass. And low tide, you can kind of see them exposed. You'll find a lot of scavengers. Here's a lightfoot crab. Here's a shore crab. They'll scurry away into the kind of crevices of rocks and stuff like that. They keep the shore clean, and they feed on algae at night. And so that hard exoskeleton kind of prevents them from having from dehydrating rapidly. All right, let's talk about a different environment, sediment-covered environment. This is sediment size in this environment is related to wave energy or water velocity. So if you have low wave energy, kind of still, tranquil waters, then you'll typically see mud flats or salt marshes. If you have high energy, like you see in that image there, a beach, that's considered high energy because you have waves crashing. Then you'll have larger particles, so sand-sized particles, or even in some places you have boulder beaches. Okay, so here are the intertidal zones in this type of environment. Okay, in the subpridal zone, which is above the highest high tide, what you'll find here, ghost crabs. So this is a typical environment you'd see at the beach, because these are a lot like a lot of recreational beaches we go to. Okay. And what organisms or common organisms you find in this type of intertidal community, they often bury themselves in the sediment because it's a highly stressful environment with crashing waves. In the high tide area, what you'll find are mostly ghost shrimp. In the middle tide area, some bristle worms. In the low tide areas where you find more organisms, clams, sand crabs, lugworms, sand stars. Okay, and then even deeper, then you'll find sand dollars, heart urchins, sea cucumbers, and horseshoe crabs. And these are referred to as infauna. A lot of these organisms are burrowing organisms. That is a clam that's burying itself in the sediment. Okay, you got to understand, in rocky communities, there's rock, right? So a lot of those barnacles and limpets can kind of anchor themselves on the rock and just remain there safely. I guess, yeah, well, I mean, they have to compete for spots on rock, like areas on a rock, but here there's nothing to hold on to because it's just sand, right? So a lot of these organisms have to dig their ways down. So there's no stable fixed surface, so they have to bury themselves to a more stable environment, which is typically just underneath the sand. In addition to that, that means there's less risk of, if they're underneath the sand, there's less temperature fluctuations, okay, and also prevents them from drying out completely. So that's why these organisms kind of burrow themselves in the sand. So here are some of the sandy beach organisms. We have bivalve mollusks, like I just showed you. There's the image there, the clam. Mussels also do the same thing. You find them mostly in low tide regions. Okay, then there are annelid worms. They create a U-shaped burrow, and sand passes through their digestive tract, and they kind of filter feed the sand. We also find crustaceans. Here they have a segmented body, really hard exoskeleton. Sand crabs are the most common. I'm sure you're very familiar with this, and they also bury themselves in the sand. You'll see tiny little holes in them. Sometimes you can dig them out. Here's an echinoderm. Echinoderms have this, they kind of bury themselves deep into the sand. And then here's their respiratory channel that reaches out into the water. Here's their sanitary channel. That's a nice way to put it. But this is where they excrete their waste. And then their mouth is here. And so they allow sand particles to go through, and they kind of filter through the organic matter. Okay. Other echinoderms that maybe you're more familiar with are starfish and heart urchins. All right, and then there are much smaller sandy beach organisms. Kind of makes you think twice about playing in the sand, right? But they're there. These are small, and they typically feed on bacteria. We have 3 different pictures here. These are scanning electron images. They live in the sediment in their intertidal zone to even deep ocean trenches. We find these guys. Here's the head of a nematode. This is an amphipod, which is a crustacean, very similar to shrimp and krill. Okay. This is a polychaete worm. These are small organisms. They typically are only about 0.1 to 2 millimeters in length. Excuse me. And really, they just feed off bacteria that are attached to the surface of sediment or sand. Okay. There are some mollusks. that are part of the Meiofauna family. All right, on the mudflats, what you'll find here are eelgrass. Turtle grass is very common. This is a much lower energy environment. You'll find bivalves and other mollusks. Fiddler crabs are common here. That's this guy, right? Don't mess with him. He's got a big left arm. That's his big left claw. They use that for, that's a male fiddler. And they use that large claw for protection and also attracting mates. Look at my claw. Okay. In shallow offshore floor communities near the subtidal zone where you have rocky bottoms, you'll find kelp. Kelp, typically at higher latitudes when compared to Florida. But kelp, they attach to rocky bottoms with a holdfast, which is this right here. Kind of holds onto the rock. And then these stipes and blades kind of grow from that holdfast. And then these are those blades. They're almost like leaves. Okay, and then they have these little hollow gas-filled chambers called pneumatosis that help them kind of float upwards in the water towards the surface. Okay, and they kind of, this is the canopy, they kind of create a canopy, and then there's a bunch of them, and we call them kind of like these kelp forests that grow all over the place. And they grow upwards basically because, they photosynthesize, so they need solar radiation from the sun, and so they kind of grow upwards towards the surface of the ocean so that they can, these blades is where they have chlorophyll, and then they can produce their food that way. So here's an image of a bunch of them together that make up that kelp forest. And those are just beds of giant brown bladder kelp. Okay, it kind of helps it stay afloat. And they can grow in waters as deep as 100 feet. And they can withstand kind of really large storms that move through the area. The holdfasts hold them down onto the seafloor pretty well. And they kind of grow upwards. They grow very large. Again, 100 feet in length in these kelp forests. And these kelp forests, they grow really quickly, and they're a highly productive ecosystem. They support a lot of organisms that live within the kelp forest. Sea urchins will eat the blades and holdfasts as they kind of crawl along the seafloor. You'll find small fish that hide within the kelp blades. Sea otters often are found in these communities. You also find mollusks, octopus, lobsters, and marine mammals in this environment. Sea slugs as well. So these are kind of rich environments. You can think of as almost like forests on the ocean floor. Here's their distribution. Like I said, higher latitudes and colder water, typically on the west coast, all along Alaska. They've got them in this portion of Australia and on the west coast of South America. And this is where we get those really cold ocean currents that come from the poles and move southward. Shrub kelp is another type of kelp, but it's much smaller. Shrub kelp is generally less than 2 feet in length, so they're not as dramatic as the kelp with air bladders. All right, other organisms that live on the bottom of the ocean floor or rocky bottoms or just offshore are lobsters. They have large spiny antennae. They live in pretty deep waters. They're scavengers, but they can also feed on live animals. There are two types. This is the type we see in Florida. In South Florida, there's a lobster hunting season. You can go out and get the spiny lobster, as they're referred to. The cool thing about the kind of Caribbean / Florida lobster, spiny lobster, doesn't have any claws, so you can just go in there and just grab them. Then this is your classic American or Maine lobster, right? So we find these in higher latitudes on the East Coast, and then they have the two claws. Yeah, watch out for that. All right, then you'll also find in rocky bottom, shallow offshore communities, you'll find oysters. They're sessile and they're bivalve mollusks. They have a very thick shell, and there's a lot of them. They're food for us, and they're also food for starfish. Sea stars, fish, crabs, snails. Snails can kind of burrow through their shell and then eat them. And oyster beds form as a result of these communities kind of living and dying, and oysters kind of grow on top of them. And it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. In fact, there are a lot of oyster beds in Florida on the panhandle off the Apalachicola River. There are oyster beds there. And there's a big project to a lot of the restaurants that serve oysters. They'll keep the shells and then they bring the shells back to the coastline and just dump them there. And that's good because it kind of revitalizes the community and you get more oysters as a result of that. They've actually found a lot of oyster beds surrounding big Native American settlements. And as you eat those oysters, you kind of throw them back in the water and you build up those oyster beds. Here's that snail. Snails can get on top of them and dissolve their hard oyster shell. They dissolve that away, and then you just siphon the oyster meat and eat off that, which is pretty crazy. And they actually release acid to dissolve it. Drilling job. All right, let's talk about coral reefs. Coral reefs are shallow water communities, meaning that they have to live within like the sunlit layers of the ocean. So they're shallow because of the coral themselves, or the zooxanthellae that live within them have to photosynthesize. But corals are polyps. Individual corals are kind of a polyp where they have like a tentacle thing that kind of, a lot of times they stick their tentacles out at night and that's how they feed. But within the polyp tissue are organisms called zooxanthellae that live within them. And those are radiolarians that are algae, and they photosynthesize. And so they provide nutrients for the coral as well. Coral reefs are distributed mostly in very warm waters. So we see the western Pacific, right? Remember, there's a lot of western intensification and the trade winds blow a lot of tropical water in this direction, so it kind of widens this area. So this is where you find a lot of tropical waters. A lot of coral reef development, right? Barrier reef is right here. This is in the western Pacific. So coral reefs need warm waters. Over here, this is where we find a lot of the coral reefs in the Caribbean. A lot of the warm waters here. We do have coral reefs in Florida as well. And then over here off the coast of Somalia and in the Arabian and Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean, you see a lot of warm water piling up on the western side and good coral reef development there. So for reefs to thrive and develop, what they need, we talked about already, warm seawater. And they need to be in the sunlit layers of the ocean floor, so they can't be in deep waters. And it's because of the zooxanthellae. And the zooxanthellae are those photosynthetic microscopic algae that live in the tissues of the coral. And this is a symbiotic relationship amongst the coral polyps and this zooxanthellae algae, because the zooxanthellae provide food for the coral polyps, and the fact that they photosynthesize and produce organic material, and the coral provide a safe home for the zooxanthellae to live within. The encasing of a coral is calcium carbonate or limestone, and that kind of protects the coral polyps as well as the zooxanthellae. It also protects them from strong waves and currents, because a lot of times you'll find coral reefs along continental margins, and that's where you see increased wave activity. And you need very clear water in these tropical areas. Why? Because sunlight needs to hit the corals. Because if you're having good solar radiation reaching the coral reef, then the zooxanthellae can produce their food. Also, you need decent or normal ranged ocean salinity, not low or not too high salinity, and then a hard substrate to kind of grow on. So rocky coastlines work pretty well. But once coral reefs start growing, they kind of build on top of each other, so they kind of make their own hard substrate in a lot of cases. And so there's that symbiotic relationship, that mutualistic relationship between the coral and zooxanthellae. Okay, here is a close-up view of the polyps coming out, so you can see that. BBC does a. Oh, by the way, yeah, I have. If you go to the My Media page, you can watch the BBC Blue Planet 2 documentary on coral reefs, which is really cool because they have time-lapse photography of corals, and you can see them kind of alien-like come out at night with their tentacles. Okay. But a coral reef is a community. It's made up of a lot of different species of coral, mollusks, foraminifera. Okay. Hermatypic coral are the ones that have that mutualistic relationship with algae. The algae provide the food, the coral provide the nutrients. But there are a lot of other animals with symbiotic relationships. The more we study the oceans, the more we realize the relationships amongst these different organisms. In one example, actually, if you watch that coral reef documentary, a grouper and an octopus actually work together and drive fish out from the little crevices and rocks and holes in the coral reef, and they communicate with each other by changing colors. Like groupers will change colors, and so will octopus. They'll change their colors, and then they'll force fish out or scare them out while the other one waits and then gulps it up, which is pretty cool. Mixotrophs are, they derive part of the nutrition from the algae, and so there are other organisms that have algae within their tissue that include coral, foraminifera, sponges, and mollusks. Here we have a giant clam, and they depend on a symbiotic algae living within its mantle tissue. Blue and brown sponges, they also host symbiotic algae and bacteria. So not only do the algae in the coral and in these organisms, nourish the coral polyps with food, but they also contribute to the calcification of the kind of calcium carbonate around the sponges and coral by extracting carbon dioxide from the coral's body fluids. And that zooxanthellae algae plays a big role in providing food for the coral. It's estimated that about 90% of their nutrition is received from this zooxanthellae algae. So they really work together to ensure survival. All right, so there's coral reef zonation. Okay, here this is an example of a volcano, let's say, in the middle of the ocean. And so there's a lot of volcanic rock, and on that volcanic rock, then you'll find coral reefs forming, and they have generations upon generations kind of building on top of each other. And the reason why there's zonation here is because there are many changes along the profile of a coral reef. Okay, many factors like changes in the amount of sunlight, wave energy, salinity, water depth, temperature. Okay, some of the factors. And the zones can be identified by the types of coral present. Okay, if you find coral here in the lagoon, it gets a lot of sunlight here, so specific species of coral that require a lot of sunlight will grow in these shallow waters. Okay, typically we have a ridge or reef crest and then a reef edge right here, so that goes down to about 60 feet. And here in this area between 60 or 20 meters and 50 meters, 20% of the light still remains, and so you'll have different species of coral that require less light, and so forth. You go down even further, only here, right around 165 feet, you have 4% of the light remains, and then right when you get beyond about 500 feet, there's not enough sunlight for coral growth. But what happens is the coral communities have grown on top of each other and kind of kept pace with the subsidence of the volcano over time. And different marine organisms live in these different zones, just depending on what are the different factors. For example, this fish here, the spotted guinea fowl, its shape it's kind of designed to take a lot of wave energy, and not be affected too much, so they live in kind of like the upper layers of the coral reef. And coral reefs are amazing habitats that host a number of different species of different organisms, and it provides food and shelter, a lot of different living spaces, nooks and crannies all over the place, specific niches that organisms can encompass, and they make up nursery areas for a lot of small fish before they're large enough to make it out to the big blue, right? So many fish species inhabit those shallow water areas, and a reef lagoon habitat is spectacular for a lot of other organisms. There are other organisms that are kind of like coral polyps but don't secrete a hard shell, like this guy over here. We call it a soft Gorgonian coral, and it has these feeding polyps that kind of grab stuff as it floats through the water itself. Almost looks like a growing tree. So coral reefs are really important. They're the largest structures created by living organisms. The Great Barrier Reef is a crazy example of this, more than 1,250 miles long. You can see it from space, has the greatest diversity of species. It's an important tourist locale. Okay, humans are they provide a lot of benefits for over 100 million people worldwide are employed in the multi-billion-dollar tropical reef tourism industry. Maybe you've participated in that or gone scuba diving or snorkeling. So it's also important for fisheries because a lot of these coral reefs are kind of like the first step for a lot of small fish organisms to kind of live in the coral reef before they go out into the big oceans. And reefs also, because they are built up in its rock, it slows down the wave energy and it protects shorelines. So when big storms come in, a lot of that wave energy is directed at these coral reefs, and that kind of lightens the wave energy further inland. There's estimated about 1/3 of the world's marine species, about 20,000 species of marine fish live and depend on coral reefs for shelter, food, and breeding grounds. Okay, so that includes sea anemones, sea stars, crabs, sea slugs, clams, sponges, sea turtles, and sharks. One pattern that we kind of notice is when human populations kind of increase on these coasts adjacent to coral reefs, the reefs deteriorate, and that's something that's constant. Here you can see a diver kind of cleaning up waste products that could cover the reef and potentially stop the zooxanthellae from photosynthesizing. So fishing, tourist collecting, and the sediment influx due to development on these coastlines can harm the coral reefs. Sewage discharge and agricultural fertilizers that run into rivers and rivers dump into the ocean, that increases the nutrients in coral reefs. And if there are higher nutrient levels, the phytoplankton mass in the water exceeds the benthic algal mass inside the coral polyps, and so those the phytoplankton food web will dominate, and then the zooxanthellae in the coral will kind of die out as a result of it. So the hermatypic corals that we talked about earlier, those depend on low nutrient levels, and so if you have too much, if you have too many chemical fertilizers in the water, then you'll get the phytoplankton algae, and that will cover or blanket the surface of the ocean, prevent sunlight from coming in, and then you get bioerosion by those coral reef eating organisms. Another problem with coral reefs is disease and coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is what you see there in that GIF, where the coral polyps die and the zooxanthellae die. So the zooxanthellae die, leave, or become toxic, and that's because of changing environmental factors. And those factors are usually associated with elevated water temperatures. And it causes the kind of colorful symbiotic zooxanthellae algae to be expelled from the coral polyp tissue. And that's why it gets that name, because it looks like the coral's got, someone bleached the coral or something, or cleaned it or something, and everything died off. But what happens is a bunch of studies have suggested that when oxygen builds up in the coral's tissue, it becomes toxic when temperatures are relatively or higher than normal. And so the coral shed that beneficial zooxanthellae algae. And so increased water temperature can cause coral bleaching. But bleaching often occurs in surface waters because that's where the temperature can fluctuate the most. But it's been observed, surface waters meaning 10 feet and higher. But these damaged corals have been observed as much as 100 feet deep in the ocean. And of course, with warmer oceans, that's linked to climate change. If we have more heat being trapped by our atmosphere, that's going to warm the oceans, and that's going to lead to more coral bleaching. So here's an example of normal coral and then bleached coral. So some other causes to coral bleaching could be elevated UV levels, a decrease in sunlight blocking particles, meaning like maybe humans that live close to the coral reef on land have diverted a lot of sediment into the rivers, and then that creates more turbidity in the water, and that blocks the sunlight. Also pollution. Increases or drastic decreases in salinity, and there's also disease associated with coral reefs, and they can be affected by coral reef pandemics as well. So it's sad to say, but only about 30% of coral reefs are healthy today, and that's down from, and this book was written or published in 2017, so I'm not sure it's gotten any better, but this is the downward trend. In the year 2000, it was estimated that only 41% of coral reef communities are healthy. So it's gone from 41 to 30. So 1/3 of coral species are at really high risk of extinction. And we are the greatest threat because we're putting a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're increasing ocean temperatures as a result, and that's causing a lot of coral bleaching. So just imagine just the species of different coral that exist in the coral reef kind of dying off, but then along with it, all the other organisms that depend on feeding on the coral. Okay, so there's a lot of species, it kind of cascades downwards. When one species goes away, it can threaten other ones. Other major threats to coral reefs, floods, excess fresh water going into areas adjacent to land that can bring in a lot of nutrients. Tsunamis, of course, global warming we talked about already, and hurricanes can create a lot of wave energy and damage coral reefs. All right, let's shift over to the deep ocean floor. And the deep ocean floor for a long time was kind of a big unknown because it's hard to get there. It's expensive to go bring a ship out to the open ocean. And it's also hard to see what's going on at the bottom of the ocean floor because the pressures are so great. It's really dark, cold. In these environments, there's limited oxygen. And you have robotic submersibles that go find crazy alien-like organisms that live in the perpetual darkness, deep, vast abyss of the ocean floor. So the deep ocean physical environment are made up of 3 different zones: the bathyl, abyssal, and hadal zones. Light is absent once you read about 1 kilometer of depth. Okay, once you get to 1 kilometer of depth, then it's lights out, and it's typically really cold, between 28 degrees and 37 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's pretty cold. Okay, between 1.8 and 3 degrees Celsius. In the deep physical environment, there's really high pressure. The waters are typically nutrient rich and have a lot of dissolved oxygen. And what's crazy is that there are actually storms that occur deep underwater. We refer to them as abyssal storms, and they affect kind of bottom currents. And part of that three-dimensional circulation of the ocean, deep mixing and bottom currents that kind of move around under the surface of the ocean. Okay, and these abyssal storms are created by the eddies that spin off of kind of major western boundary currents like the Gulf Stream, and then they kind of spin in circles, and that travels all the way down to the sea floor. So imagine, okay, it's spinning here, these eddies, and then it kind of, that circulation hits the ocean floor, and then you get those storms on the ocean floor, and they can have a warm core or a cold core, and they can last weeks. The food sources for the deep ocean floor, there's not much primary productivity, right? Remember, at the surface of the ocean, we have those phytoplankton that create their own food. That's what makes up the majority of the biomass in the ocean. So only about 1 to 3% of euphotic food is present. So these organisms have developed special adaptations for detecting food. And the species diversity in the deep ocean floor is very wide, and it's equivalent to rainforests. Okay, so here are those food sources, typically floating algae that die and drift down to the bottom. When a whale dies, it just goes down to the bottom of the ocean floor, and as soon as that happens, that provides food for weeks for organisms on the abyssal plain. Same with fish dumping, fecal pellets, crustacean molts, plankton. Okay, and then the downward movement of sediment into the abyssal plain can also provide food for these deep sea organisms. In the mid to late 70s, once the kind of robotic technology improved, there was a discovery of a lot of these deep sea hydrothermal biocommunities. The Alvin in 1977 was kind of exploring off the Galapagos Islands in complete darkness over 2.5 kilometers of depth. And what they found were chimney vents like you see here, erupting all this black, dark colored water that's really hot. This water is like 350 degrees Celsius, 3 times the temperature of boiling water, 3.5 times. And this is just seawater that has kind of hydrothermally mixed with the hot volcanic rock at the sea floor. And what was surprising to them is, I mean, I guess they weren't surprised by the vents themselves, but look, this is all life that surrounds those vents. Remember, this is in perpetual darkness. A lot of oceanographers used to think that the ocean floor in these areas, life was very sparse, especially around kind of harsh volcanic conditions. So they were very surprised to see all these organisms that lived in this harsh environment. Okay, and it spills out hot acidic water. All right, we refer to them as black smokers. So here's Alvin, kind of going down, taking pictures. And there's all kinds of different organisms. There are sea anemones. There are giant tube worms. That's what we saw earlier. These are the pillow lavas that form from the volcanic eruptions. And here are those black smokers. Okay, then there are giant tube worms, clams, and crabs. Okay. And all of these species were completely unknown to science and kind of were discovered during this time. And there are probably many more different species and different mid-ocean ridges all over the ocean floor that we haven't discovered yet. So here are all the different hydrothermal vent communities that we've found and explored, all these red dots, so all over the ocean floor. And if you think about it, all of these areas here, this is where we have active volcanism and seafloor spreading. So it's likely that there are a lot more hydrothermal vent communities in places that we haven't discovered. These areas are really far away from land and very expensive to explore. So these hydrothermal vent species include the giant tube worms, which are pictured here. They're called Riftia. They can grow up to 1 meter long. You get giant clams, giant mussels, crabs. microbial mats, and all of this life, or the basis of the life on the bottom of the seafloor. Remember, there's no solar radiation here, so there's no photosynthesis. Everything is supported by chemosynthesis. Okay, and what chemosynthesis is, these organisms are it's a bacteria. These archaea bacteria, very ancient type of bacteria that oxidize sulfur. And when they oxidize sulfur coming from the hydrothermal vents, so the water that has interacted with the hot volcanic rock has a lot of dissolved solids in it, sulfur being one of them, and it oxidizes the sulfur and creates organic matter from that, much like photosynthesis does. And then they live in a symbiotic relationship in the tissue of a lot of these organisms and provide food for them, much like the zooxanthellae do with the corals in much shallower areas of the ocean. Okay, so here are some of those. Here's a sea anemone, conch shell, crab, all at really deep areas of the ocean. So chemosynthesis are this microscopic archaea. Here are those Riftia tube worms. Okay, they grow about 3 meters long. You can see them here, and then that bacteria lives in the tissue of these guys, and so they manufacture sugar, carbon dioxide, and dissolved oxygen from hydrogen sulfide from the vents, and that's the basis of the food chain. Much like how autotrophs and phytoplankton are the basis of the food chain on the surface of the ocean, this is the basis on the sea floor in these very dark areas. Okay, so here's that reaction. Photosynthesis, as you know, sunlight plus water and carbon dioxide, and the end result you get is sugar and oxygen. So oxygen's expelled, right? For chemosynthesis, you have hydrogen sulfide, water, right? Water's present because it's the ocean. Hydrogen sulfide's present because of those volcanic vents. Carbon dioxide's also a dissolved gas within water, and oxygen, and then they create sugar and sulfuric acid as a byproduct. And then the sugar is what sustains the organisms, right? So that's a comparison of the two. And so these vents, they're not forever. They're like volcanic vents. So they're active for a certain period of time. As the plate kind of moves further away from the mid-ocean ridge, they move further and further away from the magmatic chambers, and these vents kind of eventually die off. So a lot of these vent communities are kind of like oases that live in the rift zones of these mid-ocean ridges. So like you'll have a vent community that's existing in a certain area because there's hydrothermally circulating seawater. There's a big community there. And then if that volcanism ever stops, the community's gone. Essentially, it's dead because the chemosynthetic archaea bacteria can't survive anymore. But what they count on, a lot of these organisms, is that the tube worms, they create larvae, and they just constantly broadcast spawn that into the ocean. And so that will go around on the bottom of the ocean and find a new site where there is volcanic activity and then start a new colony there. Okay, they call it the dead whale hypothesis. So that these communities can kind of spread, like say a whale dies and then a bunch of organisms show up and start feeding on that whale, and then they use another whale carcass to stepstone and move into a different environment and continue moving as that process goes. So it's like a stepping process. So the first Atlantic vents that with biocommunities were discovered much later. Remember the 1977 ones were in the Galapagos. So a lot of scientists wondered, like, oh my God, is this widespread? Yeah, and so they started finding them in the Atlantic. And when they found them in the Atlantic, the organisms looked much different. Look at these. These are, I think these are organisms. I forget what they're called. These are a swarm of shrimp. So shrimp that live in perpetual darkness at the bottom of the ocean floor around these vents. So that was pretty cool. Then they found them in the Indian Ocean. And so these vents differ in a lot of chemical and geological characteristics, and that's what leads to all the different types of species that we find there. And so we find all different types of vent communities, which are pretty crazy. And there's still a lot to be discovered. Remember, these environments are very hard to get to in the deep ocean floor, so there's probably thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different sites hosting all different types of species of organisms. So the vents are controlled by the sporadic volcanic activity. So sometimes a vent can be active for just a few years or a couple decades, but once it goes inactive, those organisms die. Here's another view of another black smoker. And any increase in volcanic activity can kill a lot of the organisms. So if there's a sporadic kind of eruption, these communities can die. So it's really, really harsh environment. And a lot of scientists now are believing that this must have been the very beginnings of life on Earth may have originated in these type of hydrothermal vents. This is a very harsh environment, and early Earth would have had a lot of these environments, meaning like a lot of ocean vents, divergent plate boundaries, a lot of volcanic activity, and archaea bacteria are very resilient. We've actually found different species of archaea bacteria like kilometers below the Earth's crust, and they're surviving. So it's thought that these conditions were a lot similar to the beginnings of Earth, and so the presence of this bacteria kind of might signal that this is one of the very first organisms that existed. There are also other communities, low temperature Seep biocommunities, which is pretty crazy. So here's the Florida platform, right? It's a big platform, flat area. Currently, these areas are inundated with rising sea level, and there's an escarpment. So this is like a cliff at the edge of this platform. And here, what happens here is a lot of salty groundwater kind of discharges at this cliff site, this escarpment area. There are areas of very high salinity, and the Florida escarpment is one of these where there are fractures in the limestone, and you have very high salinity water kind of come out of the limestone, and that hosts life, and that's crazy. So here's the location of this of a seep of high salinity water right at the edge of a platform. Here's the abyssal plain. And those waters, those sulfide-rich waters, can support a diverse biocommunity, as you can see here. This is a seep community, mussel beds, small gastropods, mussel shells, tube worms as well. So life finds a way in very unique environments at the bottom of the ocean. Okay. In addition to that, on a lot of, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, there are hydrocarbon seeps. Remember we talked about ocean pollution, and there are areas where oil just kind of seeps out of the ocean floor, oil and gas. Well, again, there's bacteria that can break down the hydrogen sulfide or methane coming from these seeps, and that then starts a whole community of hydrocarbon seep biocommunities, which is pretty crazy as well. And we find them all along these areas off the coast or the continental shelf of Texas and Louisiana. Here are some pictures. Here's a close-up view of the chemosynthetic mussels, again, and more tube worms. So you don't need volcanic activity and the hydrogen sulfide coming from volcanic vents to have this happen. You can just have oil coming from the ocean floor. And then here are some abundant mussels and tube worms in these areas as well. So ocean life is varied and can find all kinds of different environments to live in. That's why discoveries are continually being made. Even in subduction zones, the deepest parts of the oceans, there are subduction zone seeps where methane can come out of these deep trenches. These are the deepest parts of the ocean. And that methane, again, will hold life as well. So we've gone to the deepest parts of the ocean, and we found these giant white clams that are buried in the sediment here. And this is off the coast of Oregon. Okay, here's the seep area. And this is off the Juan de Fuca plate. So this is pretty incredible. Life finds a way to, in any harsh environment at the bottom of the ocean. Remember, it's very cold, and the pressure is really great down here. But there are communities that exist. And beneath the ocean floor is kind of the new frontier. We're finding more that there's life that exists within the ocean floor, deep under the sediment. We call that the deep biosphere. and there are microbes that live in the pore fluids. And that is where ongoing research is occurring today. So we're essentially drilling and collecting this ocean sediment to find out what microbes live there. And it might represent a large portion of Earth's biomass.